Hey, welcome to our Columbine United podcast. As we're reading through the book together, we make the road by walking by McLaren. So this week we are on chapter 4 of the book. The title is The Drama of Desire. The scripture for this week is Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. And it focuses on the story of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree of knowledge. The other scriptures, if you want to look them up, are Psalm 32 and Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 11. As I was thinking about this scripture this week and getting ready to preach on it this upcoming Sunday, September 20th, I was thinking after the paintings of the Nativity and Mary, probably the Immaculate Conception story of the angels appearing to Mary, I think that one of the most commonly painted biblical scenes is this scene of Adam and Eve in the garden under the tree. And it's so interesting how different artists paint this picture. You know, you could do a quick search on Google Images and see all of the different paintings, how they depict the snake, the position of the snake, Adam and Eve, their gestures, their proximity, their facial expressions. It's fascinating to see how we have interpreted this scene. And so in the first couple chapters of this book, we've talked about the origin stories, right? We have the creation story of the 7-day creation, and it is good. We have the story of God creating Adam and the woman out of dirt. And then last week, we had the creation story in the Gospel of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. And so adding on to these origin stories now this week, in the drama of desire, McLaren sort of helps us think through, then where does this concept of good and bad, good and evil, come from? And how do we talk about this in our understanding of our faith story and our identity? And so here are now the words of this chapter as we look at, as we listen to Brian's words and as we reflect on our origin story. In the ancient wisdom of storytelling, Genesis tells us that we are part of God's good creation. It then tells us we have a special responsibility as God's reflections or image bearers. It tells us that in order to reflect God's image, we have to desire the tree of life. Not the tree that feeds our pride so that we think we can play God and judge between good and evil. Of course, we know what happened. The story of Adam and Eve doesn't need to be about literal historical figures in the past to tell us something very true about us, our history, and our world today. We humans have consistently chosen the wrong tree. Instead of imitating and reflecting God as good image bearers should do, we start competing with God, edging God out, playing little gods ourselves. We reject the Creator and choose another model instead, a snake, as the story says, who seems to represent a subtle and dangerous desire to choose rivalry and violence over harmony and well-being. In Genesis, after feeding on the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve suddenly feel a change come over them. Perhaps they fear that the other will judge them for being different. So they fashion crude clothing and hide their sexual differences. This is their first awareness of nakedness. When God approaches, they no longer see God as a friend, but as a rival and a threat. So they hide from God in fear. When God asks what has happened, they blame one another and refuse to admit their mistakes. Soon, they face a harder life of pain, of competition, sweat, labor, frustration, and even death, east of Eden, outside the beautiful garden that was their home. Later, their two sons repeat this pattern. The older brother, we might say he is more advanced, becomes the agriculturalist. His life is wrapped up in fields, fences, ownership, barns, and accumulated wealth, with all the moral complexity they bring. The younger brother, we might say he's the more vulnerable or less developed, is nomadic. He can't own land or accumulate wealth because he moves constantly with his herds to wherever the fresh grass is growing. Their different ways of life are expressed in different forms of religious sacrifice. They soon become religious rivals, competing for a higher degree of God's favor. The perceived loser in the competition, Cain, envies and resents his brother. Sometime later, we can imagine Abel leading his flocks into his brother's field. At that moment, Cain, his resentment simmering, no longer sees a brother. He sees a trespasser, an enemy. He plays God and judges his brother as evil and therefore worthy of death. Abel soon becomes the first victim of violence, and Cain, the first murderer. So we humans quickly turn from reflecting the image of a creative, generous, life-giving God. With Adam and Eve, we become graspers, hiders, blamers, and shamers. As Brené Brown says, we become hustlers, trying to hustle for our worth. With Cain and Abel, we become rivals, resenters, murderers, destroyers, the very opposite of God's image. So what do these ancient stories mean for us today? They help us know what's broken with our world, something in us, human beings. And they help us know what's broken in human beings, something in our desires. They help us know what's broken with our desires. We have stopped imitating God's good desire to create and bless and give life. Instead, we started imitating prideful, competitive, fearful, and harmful desires we see in one another. The desire to acquire what someone else has, the desire to compete and consume, the desire to judge as evil those who get in our way, even the desire to harm or kill those who are obstacles in the way of our own desires. Think about how much imitation runs our lives. Somebody hits or criticizes you, and what do you want to do? Hit them back, criticize them back. Somebody buys a new shirt or a new TV, and what do you want to do? Buy an even better shirt or a bigger TV. Somebody moves to a bigger house in a different neighborhood, and what do you want? To get an even bigger house in a better neighborhood. And what happens if you can't get what you desire? You'll be tempted to cheat, steal, lie, harm, or maybe even kill to get what you desire. Now, there's nothing wrong with desire. The question is, whose desires are you imitating? To be alive is to imitate God's generous desire, to create, to bless, to help, to serve, to care for, to save and enjoy. To make the opposite choice, to imitate another's desires and become one another's rivals, is to choose the path of death. If we imitate our way into that rat race, we will compete rather than create, impress rather than bless, defeat rather than protect, dominate rather than serve, and exploit rather than respect. As a result, we turn our neighbor first into a rival, and then an enemy, and then a victim. If we all live in this drama, the drama of desire, oh no, not if, we do. We all live in this drama, the drama of desire. We have the opportunity to imitate God's generous and good desires on the one hand, and we have the temptation to imitate flesh, selfish, fearful, envious, human desires on the other hand. Think of all the adversaries who are trying to influence our desires. Oh, that's advertisers, not adversaries. That's hilarious, but maybe advertisers. Think of all the politicians who are eager to mold our desires so they can manipulate us for their advantage. This was, by the way, written 5 years ago. He's really not thinking about this election. Think of all the potential rivals who are glad to engage us in competition, their desires against ours. What's true of us as individuals can also be true of us as groups, both personally and socially. We are caught in the drama of desire, and many compete for our desires. That's another reason Jesus is so important to us, because he modeled a different way of life. He gave us a down-to-earth example of God's creative self-giving. True, Adam and Eve grabbed for the chance to be like gods, judging others as good or evil, exploiting rather than preserving the earth, competing with one another rather than loving and serving one another. But Jesus didn't grasp at godlike status. He humbly poured himself out for others in service, in suffering, even the point of death. He gave us a way of remembering his attitude of self-giving. He said that his life was like food, like bread, like wine, and he freely gave them for us. His constant invitation, "Follow me," can also be expressed as the invitation to imitate me. To be alive is to be mindful that we live in the drama of desire. We can imitate one another's competitive desires and so be driven to fear, rivalry, judging, conflict, killing. Or we can imitate God's generous desires to create, to bless, to help, to serve and care for, and to enjoy. At this moment, let us turn towards God, not as rivals who want to play God, but as image bearers who want to imitate and reflect God. Let us humbly and fervently desire the right kind of desire. I like this chapter as it's been challenging me with this question of, what are my desires? How in tune am I with my desires? Where am I tempted to be competitive with others or compare myself to others? Where do I find myself judging, making judgmental, critical thoughts or statements about that God has already created and judged as good? It's a great reminder for me. One of my favorite books that was written by a rabbi named Sandy Sasso, one of the first women rabbis in the United States. She writes a book unpacking the Cain and Abel story in this. And the way she tells it is she talks about Cain and Abel as these brothers who would lie in bed at night in their tent and share their dreams. And then jealousy and judgment and anger creeps in. And she explains this division as they stopped sharing their dreams and they started being critical of one another. And I love that image as that sharing of dreams is this reminder of the heart of God. And yet when we become critical and judgmental, it literally stops the life in us that we were created to live. So here's chapter 4 for this week. The drama of desire, the path of desire, and it invites us to be aware of how we live out desires for goodness and in places of brokenness in our own lives. Hey, thank you for spending these 14 minutes with me here today, and we look forward to continuing the journey with you next week.